The cowboy sat alone with his hungry baby, until a woman knocked with a basket of food. The wind was a thin, keening sound against the cabin's chinking, a constant reminder of the emptiness outside that matched the hollow ache inside him. Silas held the child, a bundle of frantic noise and desperate need wrapped in a fraying wool blanket. Her cries were small but sharp, piercing the heavy silence he had cultivated for months. They were the only sounds that truly reached him anymore, each one a fresh turn of the knife in a wound that would not close. He rocked her, his movements stiff and unfamiliar, a pantomime of comfort he did not feel. The motion did nothing. Her face was a red, crumpled knot of misery, her tiny fists beating against the air. He had tried the last of the watered-down goat's milk an hour ago. It was gone. The she-goat had gone dry 2 days prior, and the world had shrunk to the size of this cold room and the insistent, ravenous cry of new life. He looked down at her, this small creature named Lily, and saw only his own failure. He saw a ghost in the curve of her cheek, a ghost in the fine, dark hair plastered to her scalp. Anna's hair. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. He closed his eyes, the rough log walls of the cabin pressing in. He was a man made for breaking horses and mending fences, for reading the sky and knowing the turn of the seasons. He was not made for this. He was not made to nurture something so fragile when his own soul felt brittle as sun-scorched leather. The fire in the hearth was low, a bed of sullen orange coals that offered little light and less warmth. He should get more wood. He should do something, anything, other than sit here in this rough-hewn chair and listen to the sound of his own heart breaking with every wail from the infant in his arms. But his limbs felt weighted with lead, his will eroded by grief and exhaustion. He had not spoken a full sentence to another living soul in 4 months, not since the day the midwife had walked away from this cabin, her face grim, leaving him with a wailing baby and a silence where his wife's heartbeat used to be. The silence was his penance. The baby's cries were the accusation. He had failed the mother. Now he was failing the child. The vast, unforgiving plains of Wyoming stretched out in every direction, a sea of brown grass and gray sagebrush under a steel-colored sky. There was no help out there. There was only more emptiness, more wind. He had chosen this isolation, had built this cabin far from the nearest town, far from the pitying eyes and hushed whispers. He had wanted to be left alone with his ghosts. He had not accounted for a new one, so small and so loud, demanding to be kept alive. A sharp rap on the door startled him so profoundly that the baby's cries hitched in her throat. Silas froze, his body tensing. No one ever came out this far. No one knew he was here, save for the old trapper who passed through once a season and kept to himself. The knock came again, firmer this time. It was not the wind. It was a human hand. His first instinct was raw, protective anger. Go away. Leave us to our misery. But the baby had quieted for a moment, her head turning toward the sound, her breath catching in a shuddering sob. He stood slowly, his joints creaking in protest. Lily clutched tightly to his chest. He moved to the door, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He peered through a small crack in the timber. A woman stood on his porch, her shoulders slumped against the wind. She was thin, her dress patched and faded, a dark shawl pulled tight around her head. In her hands, she held a large, covered basket. She looked as weary as the landscape itself, her face pale and etched with lines of hardship that had no place on someone so young. He saw the caution in her stance, the way she kept her weight on her back foot, ready to retreat. She was not a threat. She was lost, or desperate. He knew the look. He saw it in the mirror every morning. He pulled the heavy door inward just enough to speak. The cold air rushed in, smelling of dust and distant rain. What do you want? His voice was a rasp, and used and harsh. The woman flinched but held her ground. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered from his face to the bundle in his arms, and a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, softened her expression. I saw your smoke, she said, her voice quiet but clear, not carried away by the wind. I have food, more than I can carry. I hope to trade. He stared at her, then at the basket. Trade for what? He had nothing. Less than nothing. His pride, a stubborn and useless thing, rose up in his throat. He was about to send her away, to shut the door on her and the world she represented, when Lily let out another thin, heartbreaking wail of hunger. The sound stripped him bare. It exposed his failure, his inadequacy, his desperation. The woman's gaze dropped to the baby again, and this time, the look was one of pure, unadorned pity. It was the one thing he could not stand. And yet, "I have stew," she said softly, as if speaking to the child. "And fresh bread. It's still warm." Silas looked from the woman's tired face to his daughter's desperate one. The scent of baked bread, faint but real, reached him, and his own stomach clenched with a hunger he had long ignored. Pride was a luxury for men who could feed their children. He had no such luxury. He stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping a strand of her dark hair across her face. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting on his answer. He gave a single, curt nod, and stepped back, pulling the door open wider. It was not an invitation. It was a surrender. She entered the cabin with a quiet hesitancy, her eyes taking in the sparse, grim interior in a single sweeping glance. The room was dominated by the stone hearth, a crude wooden table with one chair, and a cot in the corner. A cradle, rough-hewn and empty, sat near the fire. She saw the disorder, the layer of dust on every surface, the stack of unwashed tins near the water bucket. It was a place a man lived in, but it was not a home. It was a shelter, a cave against the world. Her gaze lingered on the empty cradle, then shifted to the tiny, wailing infant in his arms. She understood. Her expression remained neutral, a mask of weary composure, but Silas felt her assessment like a physical touch. He felt the shame of his neglect, the raw exposure of his grief. He gestured stiffly toward the table. "Set it there, Elara." She had not yet given her name, but it was Elara, moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent conserving energy. She placed the heavy basket on the table and lifted the cloth. The scent of warm bread, roasted vegetables, and savory meat filled the small cabin, a rich and wholesome aroma that seemed to push back against the room's stale air of sorrow. It was the smell of life, of sustenance, of care. Felt alien in this place. She took out a small, cloth-wrapped loaf of bread, a stoneware jar of stew, and 2 apples, their skins a little wrinkled but still firm. She arranged them on the table, her movements deliberate and graceful. Silas watched her hands. They were chapped and red from work and cold, but they were capable. He found himself unable to look at her face. He was a man drowning, and she had just thrown him a rope. He did not know if he had the strength to take it. He cleared his throat. "I have no coin. I'm not asking for coin," she said, her voice still quiet. She looked around the cabin again, her gaze practical. "A place by the fire for the night. The wind is picking up. A storm is coming." He glanced toward the single grimy window. The sky had darkened to a bruised purple gray. She was right. The air had that heavy, electric feel that came before a bad plain storm, the kind that could drop a foot of snow in a few hours, even this late in the season. To send her out in that would be a death sentence. He was a broken man, but he was not a murderer. Still, the thought of another person in his space, another presence in the suffocating bubble of his grief, felt like an intrusion he could not bear. His solitude was his shield. But Lily began to cry again, a weak, sputtering sound this time. Her energy was fading. The woman looked at the baby, and her resolve seemed to harden. "Your child is hungry," she stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, undeniable fact. She broke off a small piece of bread, dipped it into the thick gravy of the stew until it was soft, and held it out. Not to him, but toward the baby. It was an offering, a solution. Silas hesitated for only a second before the baby's need won out over his own stubborn pride. He sat in the chair, settling Lily in his lap. He took the morsel of bread from the woman's fingers. Her skin was cold. He brought the softened bread to Lily's lips. At first, she turned her head away, too used to crying to accept comfort. But the savory scent reached her, and her mouth opened, rooting instinctively. She sucked at the bread, her small body going still with concentration. A soft, contented sound, half sigh, half moan, escaped her. It was the first sound of peace he had heard from her in 2 days. He dipped another piece and another. He fed his daughter, his large, clumsy hands surprisingly gentle. The woman watched, her face unreadable. She took the second apple from the basket and began peeling it with a small knife she produced from a pocket in her dress. The thin green peel spiraling down in a single, unbroken piece. She did not pry. She did not ask about the baby's mother, or why he was alone, or why his cabin was a study in disarray. She simply created a small pocket of order in his chaos. She filled the silence not with questions, but with quiet, purposeful action. When Lily was full, her belly round and her eyelids heavy, she fell asleep in his arms, her breathing deep and even. The relief that washed over Silas was so immense it left him lightheaded. He had not realized how tautly he had been holding himself until the tension finally eased. He looked up at the woman. She was still standing by the table, the peeled apple in her hand. "Thank you," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue. She gave a slight nod, accepting his gratitude as simply as she had offered the food. She ate her apple, chewing slowly, her gaze fixed on the dying fire. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the crushing, absolute silence of despair. It was the shared silence of two strangers under one roof, a quiet space filled with the sound of the rising wind and a sleeping baby's breath. He laid Lily gently in the cradle, tucking the worn blanket around her. For the first time, the cradle did not look like a tiny coffin. It looked like a bed. He turned back to the woman. "The storm," he said, by way of explanation. "You can take the cot. I'll sit by the fire." She looked at the cot, then at him, her expression weighing the offer. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the deep shadows under her eyes. She was a survivor, and survivors knew when to accept shelter. "My name is Alara," she said finally. He nodded. "Silas." He did not offer his hand. She did not expect it. He took a log from the woodbox and placed it on the coals. Sparks flew up, and a flame caught, pushing back the shadows. He settled into the hard-backed chair, his rifle across his knees. She laid her shawl on a peg by the door and moved to the cot, lying down without removing her dress or boots. Within minutes, her breathing evened out into the slow rhythm of sleep. Silas sat awake, watching the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and the two quiet heartbeats inside. For the first time in months, he was not entirely alone. He did not know if that was a comfort or a curse. He only knew it was a change. And change, he feared, was a dangerous thing. A routine, unspoken and unnegotiable, settled over the cabin in the days that followed. The storm passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and a fragile truce within the 4 log walls. Alara did not leave. Silas did not ask her to. Her presence became a silent fact, like the sunrise or the endless wind. She rose before him each morning, moving with a quiet efficiency that never disturbed his restless sleep. When he awoke, the fire would be built, and the smell of chicory root coffee would hang in the air. She would be sitting in the cabin's second chair, which she had repaired with a strip of leather from her own worn satchel, holding Lily. She would feed the baby, her touch infinitely more practiced and gentle than his own. She knew the soft, cooing sounds that soothed Lily's fussing, the exact way to hold her to ease the colic that sometimes gripped the infant's tiny stomach. Silas watched her from a distance, a knot of gratitude and resentment tangled in his chest. He was thankful for the help, for the simple fact that his daughter was clean, fed, and quiet. But every competent gesture was a fresh reminder of his own inadequacy, of the void Anna had left behind. He felt like a stranger in his own life, a silent observer of a domestic scene he had no part in creating. While Alara cared for the child and the hearth, Silas turned his energy outward, to the endless work the homestead demanded. He split logs with a fierce, punishing rhythm, the axe rising and falling, each blow a release of some pent-up frustration. He mended the section of fence the storm had flattened, his hands working with practiced skill, stretching the wire taut, driving the staples deep into the posts. He worked until his muscles burned and his mind was blessedly empty, focused only on the task at hand. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Their paths rarely crossed. When he came inside for a midday meal, a bowl of stew and a piece of bread would be waiting for him on the table. He would eat standing, his back to her, and leave as soon as he was finished. She would take his empty bowl without a word. Their conversations were sparse, functional. Need more water. The wood box is full. The goat is giving milk again. Each sentence was a stone dropped into a deep well of silence. He learned about her not through words, but through observation. He saw the way she carefully saved and dried seeds from the vegetables she cooked, wrapping them in a small cloth. He saw the way she mended Lily's blankets with neat, tiny stitches, reinforcing the worn fabric. He saw the way her eyes would sometimes drift to the far horizon, her expression distant and clouded with a sorrow she kept locked away. He knew she had a story, a loss as profound as his own, but he did not ask. He did not want to know. Her past was her own burden, just as his was his. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin earlier than usual, a cold rain driving him indoors. He found her sitting in the wooden rocker by the window, a piece of furniture he had built for Anna but had not been able to look at since her death. Elara had dragged it from the dusty corner and was rocking gently, humming a low, tuneless melody to the sleeping baby in her arms. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow. That was Anna's chair. That was the spot where she was supposed to sit, humming to their child. The anger that flared in him was hot and irrational. He wanted to shout, to tell her to get out of that chair, to leave his ghosts in peace. He opened his mouth, the harsh words already forming on his tongue. But then he saw her face. In the gray afternoon light, her guard was down. The weary composure had slipped, and what remained was an expression of such profound tenderness and longing that it stole the breath from his lungs. She was not replacing Anna. She was simply a woman comforting a motherless child, finding a moment of peace in a world that had clearly offered her very little of it. The anger receded, leaving behind a hollow ache. He turned and left the cabin, walking back out into the cold rain. He did not return until dusk. The rocker was back in its corner. Elara was by the fire stirring a pot. Neither of them mentioned it. But something had shifted. The line he had drawn between them, the rigid boundary of his grief, had been blurred. He had seen her not as an intruder or a temporary helper, but as a person with her own quiet sorrows, her own deep capacity for care. He began to notice smaller things. The way she had scrubbed the floor until the packed earth was smooth and clean. The way she had arranged a few hardy winter weeds in a tin cup on the windowsill, a small, stubborn touch of beauty in the grim room. She was not just occupying the space. She was taming it, coaxing a semblance of home from the rough logs and cold stone. Trust was not a decision they made. It was a slow, creeping vine, growing in the silence between them. He stopped leaving his rifle across his knees when he sat by the fire at night. She stopped flinching when he entered the cabin suddenly. They were two solitary creatures learning the rhythms of a shared orbit, drawn together by the gravity of a small child. The baby Lily was the bridge. She was the one thing they could both touch, both care for without reservation. When she smiled her first real smile, a gummy, whole-face expression of delight, she smiled it at Elara. But it was Silas who was standing in the doorway, watching, and felt his own lips twitch in response. It was the first time he had felt anything close to joy in a very long time. It was a fragile beginning, a single green shoot pushing up through frozen ground. The days shortened, and the wind carried a sharper bite. The landscape bleached to shades of tan and gray. Inside the cabin, a quiet rhythm had become a routine, and the routine was slowly, imperceptibly, building a life. The small gestures, once novel, became part of the silent language they shared. It was a language of action, not words. Silas, finding a thin spot in the sole of Alara's worn boot, left a square of thick leather and a cobbler's needle on the table for her one morning. He said nothing. When he returned that evening, the boot was patched with his leather, the stitches small and even. She said nothing. But the next day, a button that had been missing from his heavy wool coat for a year was sewn firmly in place, the thread a perfect match to the dark fabric. Alara, struggling to haul 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, would find the next morning that Silas had rigged a simpler pulley system, making the task manageable with one hand. She never thanked him aloud, but that evening, his portion of stew would have the choicest pieces of meat, the thickest gravy. He was a man who understood the world through things he could build and fix. He could not fix the gaping hole in his own heart, but he could fix a loose porch board. He could not mend his shattered past, but he could reinforce the wall of the lean-to where the goat sheltered from the wind. He spent an entire afternoon honing the blade of her small utility knife until it was sharp enough to shave with, leaving it resting on the cutting board where she would find it. It was his way of saying, "I see you. I see your struggle. I can help with this, at least." She, in turn, brought a quiet order to his world. She discovered a small cache of Anna's things packed away in a wooden chest. A few dresses, a book of pressed flowers, a half-finished piece of embroidery. She did not ask about them. Instead, she took one of the simpler calico dresses, washed it, and painstakingly altered it to fit herself. When Silas saw her wearing it, a pang of memory so sharp it made him dizzy shot through him. But the dress was no longer just a relic of his grief. On Alara, it was simply a piece of clothing, worn by a living, breathing woman who was making a life here. She gave it a new purpose, and in doing so, she seemed to lessen the power of the ghost that haunted it. The most significant change was the coat. His old sheepskin coat, the one he wore through blizzards and bitter winds, had become a shared object. He would wear it out to the fence line, and when he returned, she would take it from him to wear for her brief trips to the well or the woodpile. It was too large for her, the sleeves swallowing her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. But it held the warmth of the fire and, she noticed, the faint, clean scent of pine from his work. It became a symbol of their shared existence. A tangible piece of protection passed between them. A storm was building, not in the sky this time, but on the horizon of their lives. Silas knew their supplies were running low. The flour sack was nearly empty, the salted pork dwindling. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride, and he had been putting off the trip, reluctant to face the world, to leave the fragile piece of the cabin. He was also reluctant to leave Alara and Lily alone. The thought unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. He trusted Alara to care for his daughter, but the idea of the cabin being empty of his presence, of them being out here, vulnerable, gnawed at him. He found himself watching the horizon more often, scanning for riders that never came. The isolation he had once craved now felt like a liability. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, he saw Alara shiver as she sat by the fire, despite her shawl. The cabin, for all its sturdiness, could not keep out the deep, penetrating cold of a Wyoming winter. The next day, he disappeared into the small stand of trees behind the cabin. He spent hours there, and when he returned, he was dragging 2 large, flat stones. He worked all afternoon, using his limited tools and a mixture of mud and dried grass to build a second, smaller hearth on the far side of the cabin, near the cot where she slept. It was a crude, ugly thing, but it was functional. That night, for the first time, 2 small fires burned in the cabin. The room was filled with a steady, encompassing warmth. Alara sat on the edge of the cot, her hands outstretched to the new fire, her face illuminated by the soft, flickering light. She looked up at him across the room. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were clear and direct. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. It was more than a simple expression of gratitude for the warmth. It was an acknowledgement of everything he had done, of all the silent acts of care. It was the first crack in the wall of formality between them. He stood by the main hearth, his own hands shoved deep in his pockets, and gave a short, stiff nod. But inside, something shifted. Her words, her quiet acknowledgement, were like a warm stone dropped into a frozen pond. The ripples spread outward, thawing something he thought had been frozen solid forever. He had built a fire for her. He had brought warmth to her corner of his world. And in doing so, he felt a flicker of warmth himself. The cold deepened, settling into the bones of the land. It came with a stillness, the air so frigid it seemed to crackle. And with the cold came the fever. It started with Lily. One evening she was fretful, refusing to eat, her skin hot and dry to the touch. By morning, she was burning, her small body limp in Alara's arms, her breath coming in shallow, rasping pants. A raw, primal fear seized Silas. It was a terrifyingly familiar feeling. He saw Anna, her face pale with exhaustion, her body slick with the sweat of a fever that had come after the birth. He saw the midwife's helpless shrug. He saw the life draining out of the woman he loved, and he had been powerless to stop it. Now it was happening again. The same enemy had invaded his home, threatening the only piece of Anna he had left. His first instinct was to ride for a doctor, a fool's errand. Redemption was a day's ride in good weather. In this cold, it could take 2. Lily didn't have 2 days. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his fists clenched, his mind a maelstrom of guilt and terror. "I should have gone to town sooner," he muttered, the words torn from him. "We need medicine." Alara, however, was a rock of calm in his storm of panic. Her face was pale, her lips a thin, tight line, but her hands were steady as she bathed Lily's face with a cloth dipped in cool water. "Panic won't help her," she said, her voice low and firm, cutting through his haze of fear. "We have to bring the fever down. Keep her warm but not too warm. And we need to get fluids in her." She took command of the cabin. She sent him out to bring in snow, which she melted for fresh, clean water. She rummaged through the small bundle of personal belongings she'd arrived with and produced a small, cloth-wrapped packet of dried herbs. "Willow bark," she explained, crushing the brittle leaves into a powder. "It helps with the fever. My mother taught me." She mixed the powder with a little water and, drop by drop, managed to get the bitter liquid into Lily's mouth. Silas watched, his helplessness a bitter taste in his throat. He was strong, capable, a man who could survive in the harshest of environments. But here, in the face of this invisible enemy, his strength was useless. He could only obey Alara's quiet commands. More wood for the fire, more snow for water, another blanket. That night, a blizzard descended. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, and snow began to pile in deep drifts against the door and window. They were completely cut off, sealed in a world of white fury. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and Lily's labored breathing. They kept vigil together, a silent, desperate team. Alara sat in the rocker, the sick child cradled against her chest, her body a source of constant, steady warmth. Silas sat on a stool beside her, his job to keep the fire fed and to watch. He watched the rise and fall of Lily's chest. He watched the flush on her cheeks. He watched Alara, her face etched with exhaustion in the firelight, her eyes never leaving the child. She hummed softly, the same low, nameless tune he'd heard before, a sound of pure, maternal comfort. In the darkest hours before dawn, Lily began to shiver violently. Her breathing grew more ragged. Alara looked at Silas, and for the first time he saw fear in her eyes. "She's so small," she whispered, her voice trembling. Without thinking, Silas reached out and covered Alara's hand with his own. Her hand, holding the baby, was cold as ice. His was rough and calloused, but it was warm. He wrapped his fingers around hers, a simple, grounding touch. "We're not losing her," he said, his voice a low growl. It was not a prayer. It was a promise, a declaration of war against the sickness, against the ghosts, against his own past. He would not be helpless this time. He moved the stool closer, pulled his own chair to face them, and draped his heavy sheepskin coat over Alara and the baby, trapping their shared body heat. He sat there, his hand still covering hers, and together they formed a small, human fortress against the storm and the fever. They did not speak again. They simply sat, two solitary people bound by a shared, desperate hope, lending each other their warmth and their will. He felt the faint, steady beat of Alara's pulse beneath his palm. He listened to the sound of her humming, the wind, the fire. He stayed. He did not run from the fear or the memory. He stayed and he watched and he willed his daughter to live. Sometime near dawn, the shivering stopped. Lily's breathing, while still shallow, seemed to ease. A light sheen of sweat broke on her forehead. Alara touched her cheek. "The fever," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "I think it's broken." Silas felt the tension drain out of him so completely he felt he might collapse. He looked at their joined hands, his dark and weathered, hers pale and slender, and slowly, he withdrew his own. The blizzard raged for another day, but inside the cabin, the crisis had passed. Lily slept, a deep, healing sleep. Alara, finally succumbing to exhaustion, dozed in the rocker. Silas watched them both, a profound sense of change settling over him. He had faced his greatest fear and had not been alone. She had let him in. She had let him help. In the crucible of the fever, something new had been forged between them. Not quite trust, not yet affection, but a hard-won, unspoken partnership. They had weathered the storm both outside and in. The world outside was a vast, blinding expanse of white when the blizzard finally blew itself out. The snow was piled halfway up the cabin door, sealing them in. But inside, a quiet peace had settled. Lily was weak but awake, her fever gone, her eyes clear. She drank the goat's milk Alara offered her. Her small fists curled contentedly. The silence that returned was different from any that had come before. It was not the silence of avoidance or grief, but a comfortable, shared quiet, born of a trial endured together. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable. His raw panic, her bone-deep weariness, and had not turned away. That afternoon, as Silas worked to clear a path from the door, Alara spoke into the quiet. "You built this cabin well," she said, her gaze on the sturdy roof beams that had held against the storm's fury. "It's a good, strong house." Silas paused, his shovel resting on a mound of snow. He looked back at the small, solid structure. "I built it for her," he said, the words coming out rough, unpracticed. For Anna, it was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to Alara. It hung in the cold, still air between them. Alara did not offer empty platitudes or words of pity. She simply nodded, accepting the information as a sacred trust. She waited, letting him decide if he would say more. He leaned the shovel against the wall and came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He poured himself a cup of chicory coffee, his back to her. "She wanted a place away from things," he continued, his voice low, directed at the wall in front of him. "A place where we could be, just us." He took a sip of the bitter coffee. "She picked this spot, said she could see the whole world from here." He fell silent, lost in the memory. Alara remained quiet, her hands busy mending a small tear in one of Lily's blankets. Her silence was an invitation, a space for him to fill if he chose. "The birth was hard," Silas said, the words tasting like ash. "Too hard. The midwife did what she could. But the fever came after." He stopped, unable to go on. The story was there, in the tense set of his shoulders, in the stark emptiness of the cabin. Alara's needle paused in its work. She looked down at the sleeping child in the cradle, then back at Silas's rigid back. "She must have been very beautiful," she said softly. The statement surprised him. It was not what he expected. People usually spoke of sorrow, of loss. Alara spoke of beauty. He turned from the wall to look at her. "How did you know?" "Lily has her eyes," Alara answered simply. "And no one would build a house like this for a woman who was not loved very much." His breath caught in his throat. In a few simple sentences, she had seen it all. The love, the dream, the devastating loss. She had not judged his grief or his failure. She had honored his love. He sat down heavily in his chair by the fire, the coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. He felt seen. For the first time since Anna's death, he felt as though someone saw past the broken, reclusive man he had become and caught a glimpse of the man he had been. It was Alara's turn to speak into the quiet. "My husband, Thomas, he was a farmer," she said, her eyes on her mending, but her thoughts clearly far away. "He wasn't strong, but he was stubborn. He believed in the land. He believed if you worked hard enough, it would provide." She paused, her fingers smoothing the worn fabric of the blanket. "The drought proved him wrong. Took the crops, then the cattle. Then it took him. He worked himself into the grave trying to save a place that was already dead." She looked up, and her gaze met Silas's. "When he died, the banker, Mr. Croft, took the rest. The farm, the house, everything. Said it was forfeit on the loan. There it was. The story he had known existed, laid bare in the quiet of the cabin. 2 stories of loss, of dreams turned to dust on the unforgiving plains. They were not so different, he and this quiet, resilient woman. They were both survivors of a wreck, clinging to whatever driftwood they could find. Lily stirred in her cradle, making a soft, snuffling sound. Alara put her mending aside and went to her, picking her up and settling into the rocker. Silas watched them, the woman and his child, framed by the firelight. They looked right there. They looked like they belonged. The conversation had not healed them. The wounds were too deep for that. But it had lanced a festering boil of solitude. They were no longer just 2 strangers sharing a roof. They were 2 people who knew each other's ghosts. And in that shared knowledge, there was the faint, fragile promise of a new beginning. The snowbound cabin, once his prison of grief, had become a sanctuary. The thaw came slowly, first in drips from the eaves, then in muddy rivulets that carved paths through the snow. With the cleared land came the urgent need for supplies. The flour was gone, the salt nearly so. The trip to redemption could no longer be postponed. This time, the thought of the journey was different. He was not just a man going to town for his own needs. He was providing for a family. The word hung, unspoken, in his mind. Family. He loaded the wagon with a few pelts he'd trapped over the winter, the only currency he possessed. When he went to hitch the horse, he found Alara standing by the cabin door, Lily bundled in her arms, a small sack of her own meager belongings at her feet. "We're coming with you," she said. It was not a request. "It's a long ride," he countered, his voice gruff. The child needs things we don't have," she finished for him. "And I will not be left," he understood her meaning. She would not be left behind, a dependent waiting for his return. She was his partner in this, whether he had acknowledged it or not. He also understood the unspoken part. She would not stay here alone and vulnerable. He looked at her determined face, at the trusting weight of his daughter in her arms, and he knew he could not deny her. He simply nodded and helped her onto the wagon seat. The town of Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place of harsh sun and quiet judgment. As they pulled up to the general store, Silas felt the familiar eyes of the townspeople on them. He was a known recluse, a man who had buried his wife and disappeared. Now he returned with a strange woman and a baby. He could feel their whispers, their curiosity hardening into suspicion. He helped Alara down from the wagon, his hand briefly on her elbow. It was a simple courtesy, but in the charged atmosphere of the town, it felt like a public declaration. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods. Silas began his trading with the storekeeper, his words clipped and efficient. Alara moved through the aisles, her eyes taking in the bolts of fabric, the sacks of flour, the simple necessities that felt like unimaginable luxuries. As she reached for a small tin of soothing salve for Lily's chapped skin, a voice, slick with false cordiality, cut through the quiet. Well, Alara, I see you've landed on your feet." She froze. Silas turned. A portly man in a too-tight suit stood there, a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. His smile did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. It was Mr. Croft, the banker. Alara's face became a pale, still mask. She clutched Lily a little tighter. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Croft's eyes slid from Alara to Silas, then to the baby. His smile widened into a sneer. And with a child, no less. I must say, you work fast. Found yourself a new provider, have you? Though I'd have thought you'd aim higher than a half-wild hermit. The insult was directed at Alara, but it was designed to shame them both, to paint her as a desperate woman of loose morals and him as her foolish keeper. The few other customers in the store fell silent, their eyes wide with anticipation. This was town entertainment. Alara visibly flinched, her shoulders curling inward as if to shield the baby from the man's venom. She looked small, defeated, the quiet dignity she always wore stripped away by his public cruelty. In that moment, Silas felt a surge of rage so pure and hot it burned away the last of his apathy. This man was not just insulting Alara. He was defiling the quiet decency she had brought into his life. He was mocking the fragile sanctuary they had built. He was kicking at the foundations of their new world. Silas moved without thinking. He took 2 long strides and stood directly between Croft and Alara, shielding her completely with his body. He was taller than the banker, broader, his presence filling the space with a quiet, physical menace. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You will not speak to her again," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Croft, flustered by the sudden confrontation, puffed out his chest. "I'll speak to whomever I please. She's nothing but a squatter who couldn't pay her debts." "She's with me," Silas stated. The words were simple, declarative. But in the context of this town, this moment, they were everything. They were a claim, a protection, a bond made public. He reached back without looking, his hand finding Alara's arm, a firm, reassuring pressure. "Her debts are her past. Her future is my concern." He held Croft's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. The banker, a man accustomed to bullying the weak, found himself facing a strength he could not intimidate. He saw something in Silas's eyes, a history of loss that had left no room for fear, and he faltered. With a dismissive sniff, Croft turned and stalked out of the store, the silence he left behind ringing in the ears of everyone present. Silas did not move until the man was gone. He slowly released Alara's arm, his hand lingering for a moment. He could feel her trembling. He turned to the storekeeper, who was staring, his mouth agape. "Add that tin of salve to my bill," Silas said, his voice returning to its normal, quiet tone. He finished his business, paid with his pelts, and loaded their supplies into the wagon. He and Alara did not speak. They did not need to. The entire town had witnessed his defense of her. He had drawn a line in the dust of that street. On one side was the cruel, judgmental world. On the other side was the two of them and the child. He had publicly redeemed her honor, and in doing so had taken the first step toward redeeming his own. As they rode out of town, the silence in the wagon was no longer tense or uncertain. It was solid. It was foundational. He had named her as his. She belonged with him. It was a truth spoken aloud for the first time, and it changed everything. The journey back to the cabin was made in a profound and comfortable silence. The declaration in the store had cleared the air between them, settling the dust of uncertainty. He had claimed her. He had protected her. The words "she's with me" echoed in the quiet rhythm of the horses' hooves on the dirt track. They were no longer two separate individuals sharing a space out of necessity. They were a unit defined and defended. When the cabin came into view, nestled in its small clearing, it looked different. It was no longer just his place of exile or her temporary refuge. It looked like a destination. It looked like home. The change that followed was not one of dramatic pronouncements, but of small, domestic acts that solidified their new reality. Alara, with a sack of seeds purchased in town, started a small garden in a patch of earth Silas tilled for her near the cabin door. She planted rows of beans, squash, and hardy greens, her hands moving with a practiced knowledge of the soil. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that extended beyond the next meal. It was the act of putting down roots. Silas watched her from a distance as he repaired the roof of the lean-to. He saw the way she knelt in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, and felt a sense of rightness, a deep-seated peace that had been absent from his life for so long. This was what a home was supposed to look like. A woman tending a garden, a man mending a roof, the promise of a future harvest in the ground. He found himself working on projects that were not for mere survival but for comfort. He built a small, sturdy pen for the handful of chickens Alara had traded for with a piece of her mended lace. He sanded down the rough edges of the cradle until the wood was smooth as silk beneath a baby's hand. He even fixed the broken hinge on the wooden chest of Anna's things, an object he had avoided for months. He was no longer just maintaining a shelter. He was building a life for all of them. The true measure of the change was in Lily. Freed from the confines of the cabin by the warming weather, she began to explore her world. She learned to crawl on a blanket Alara spread in the sun, her delighted squeals filling the air. Her laughter, a sound Silas had once thought he would never hear without a pang of grief, now brought a warmth to his chest. It was a clean sound, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. One afternoon, as Silas sat on the porch step oiling a piece of harness, Lily pulled herself up, her tiny hands gripping his pant leg for support. She stood there, swaying unsteadily for a moment, a look of intense concentration on her face. Then she let go. She took one wobbly step, then another, before tumbling softly into the grass at his feet. She looked up at him, her face breaking into a wide, triumphant, toothless grin. Silas felt his own face crack into a smile. He reached down and scooped her up, tossing her gently in the air. Her shriek of laughter was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Alara, who had been watching from the doorway of the cabin, smiled too, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face. In that moment, looking from the laughing child in his arms to the smiling woman in the doorway, Silas felt the last of the ice around his heart finally melt away. The ghost of Anna was still there, a soft, sad memory, but she was no longer a constant, painful presence. The cabin was no longer haunted by what he had lost. It was filled with what he had found. The wooden rocker, Anna's rocker, was no longer a painful reminder. It had become Alara's chair. She sat there every evening, rocking Lily to sleep, her low humming a constant, soothing presence in the house. She had not replaced Anna. She had brought life back into the spaces that grief had left empty. She had made the silent cabin sing again. The home he had built out of love and hope for one woman had been reclaimed from despair to become a home for another. It was a different life than the one he had planned, a different family than the one he had imagined. But as he looked at Alara, her face soft in the evening light, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that it was a good life. It was enough. The seasons turned, bleeding one into the next. Summer brought a haze of heat and the drone of insects, the green stalks in Alara's garden growing thick and strong. Autumn painted the sparse cottonwoods by the creek in strokes of brilliant yellow, and the air grew crisp with the promise of coming cold. Through it all, the rhythm of their life held steady, a quiet, reassuring beat. The silence that had once defined the cabin had transformed. It was no longer an absence, a void where words and laughter should have been. It was now a presence in itself, a shared language of understanding that required no speech. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who knew each other's movements by heart. It was the soft thud of Silas's axe from the woodpile, the gentle scrape of Alara's hoe in the garden, the musical creak of the rocker on the floorboards. It was a silence filled with the small, life-affirming sounds of home. Silas found himself watching her more and more, not with the cautious assessment of a stranger, but with a deep and burgeoning affection. He watched the way the sun caught the stray hairs that escaped her braid. He watched the efficient grace of her hands as she kneaded dough or stitched a seam. He watched the way her eyes softened when she looked at Lily. He was a quiet man, not given to flowery words or grand gestures. His feelings had always been expressed through his actions, through the work of his hands. One cool morning, on his way back from checking a trap line, He saw a patch of stubborn, late-blooming wildflowers, a splash of deep purple against the dry brown grass. He stopped. He stood looking at them for a long time before carefully picking a single, perfect stem. He carried it back to the cabin, feeling foolish, his calloused fingers clumsy around the delicate stalk. He did not know how to give it to her. He did not have the words. So he simply left it on the kitchen table, next to her mending basket, and quickly went back outside to busy himself with chores. When he came in for the midday meal, the flower was in the tin cup on the windowsill, its vibrant color a focal point in the simple room. Alara said nothing. She did not look at him. But as she placed his bowl of soup on the table, her fingers brushed against his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was enough. The coat, his old sheepskin coat, still hung on its peg by the door. It was no longer his or hers. It was theirs. It was a permanent fixture, a symbol of the protection and warmth they offered each other. Sometimes, in the evenings, when a chill wind blew down from the mountains, she would sit by the fire with the coat draped over her shoulders like a heavy blanket. It dwarfed her, but she seemed to find comfort in its familiar weight, its scent of wood smoke and winter air. It belonged there, just as she belonged there. One night, a deep cold had settled in again. A fire burned in both hearths, casting a warm, dancing glow across the room. Lily was asleep in her cradle, her breath a soft, rhythmic whisper. Silas was on the floor, mending a bridle, the leather slick with oil in his hands. Alara sat in the rocker, darning one of Lily's small stockings, her head bent in concentration. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside. It was a scene of perfect, domestic peace. Silas finished his work, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked up at Alara. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the line of her throat. A feeling rose in him, so powerful and so certain that it felt like the only truth in the world. He had built this cabin with his hands, but she had made it a home with her heart. She had walked into his desolate life and had patiently, quietly, replanted it with kindness and care. He loved her. The realization did not startle him. It felt as if he had known it all along, as if the knowledge had been growing quietly inside him, like a seed in her garden, waiting for the right season to bloom. He rose from the floor and crossed the small room. He stopped in front of her chair. Alara looked up from her sewing, her hands going still in her lap. Her eyes questioned him in the flickering light. He did not have the words. He had never had the words for the things that mattered most. So he let his hands speak for him. He reached out not to touch her face or her hair, but to gently take the mended stocking and the needle from her grasp. He set them aside on the small table next to her. Then he knelt before her so their eyes were on the same level. He took her hands in his. Her hands were no longer the chapped, work-roughened hands of a desperate traveler. They were still strong, still capable, but there was a softness to them now. They were the hands that had soothed his daughter's fever, kneaded their daily bread, and tended their garden. They were the hands that had mended his life. He simply held them, his large, rough palms enveloping hers. He looked into her eyes, the color of a winter sky, and let her see everything he could not say. He let her see the gratitude, the respect, the deep, quiet love that had taken root in the barren soil of his heart. A long moment passed. The fire crackled. The wind moaned softly around the eaves. Alara's gaze never wavered from his. She saw it all. She understood the silent vow he was making. She did not pull away. Instead, she slowly turned her hands within his, her fingers curling to grip his tightly. It was an answer. It was an acceptance. It was a promise returned. There, in the warm, firelit cabin, surrounded by the vast and empty plains, two solitary souls, weathered by loss and hardship, finally found their harbor. From the deepest silence had come the truest warmth. From a chance knock on a stranger's door had come the slow, patient building of a family. He had been a man alone with his ghosts and a hungry baby. She had been a woman with nothing but her own resilience and a basket of food. Now they were a man and a woman with a child, a home, and a future they would build together, one quiet day at a time. The coat remained on its hook by the door, a silent guardian. The rocker creaked softly as she shifted her weight. His hand rested on hers, a firm and steady anchor. She stayed,